Before there was anything, there was water. Not the kind of water you know. Not the cold water of rivers or the shallow water of monsoon ponds. This was something older than that, something the ancient texts of India call the primordial ocean, the vast and dark and undifferentiated sea that existed before the universe had learned to be itself. Before light. Before direction. Before the idea of inside and outside, before the word sky had any sky to name. There was only the water. And on the water, floating, resting on the coil of an enormous serpent, lay a god. He was not awake. He was not asleep in the way you are almost asleep right now, with a body that remembers the shape of the day just ended. He existed in a state for which the Sanskrit language has a specific word, yoga nidra. Yogic sleep. A state between consciousness and unconsciousness so profound and so complete that the entire universe was held within it like a dream that has not yet decided to begin. His name was Vishnu, the preserver. The one who holds the world together across the enormous gaps of time. And the serpent beneath him, the great coiled snake called Shisha or Ananta, meaning infinity, meaning the endless one, was both his resting place and his canopy, its thousandhood spread above him like the sky that did not yet exist. If you were to look at this scene, and there was no one to look, because looking required a world, and the world was still inside the dream, you would see only the dark water, and the sleeping god, and the slow, regular movement of the serpent's breathing, which moved the water in long, ancient waves that traveled in no particular direction because there was no shore to travel toward. This is where we are beginning tonight. In the dark before the first light. In the quiet before the first sound. In the space that Hindu cosmology understands not as emptiness but as fullness, a fullness so complete, so dense with potential, that it contains within itself everything that will ever exist, waiting with the patience of something that has no concept of waiting, because time itself has not yet begun. Let your body settle. Let the weight of you become the weight of the bed, of the floor, of the earth beneath the floor. The stories of ancient India are very old, and they will come at whatever pace suits them. There is nowhere to be except here. There is nothing to hold on to. Only the water. Only the dark. Only the sound of the serpent breathing, somewhere far below everything you know. The shape of ancient Indian thought. The mythology of ancient India is unlike the mythologies of other civilizations in one particular and important way. Most ancient mythologies, Greek, Norse, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, exist within a cosmology of finite time. The gods are born, they struggle, they age, the universe ends. It ends once, and then it is over. The Hindu cosmological imagination rejected this. Utterly and completely. For the thinkers of ancient India, the universe did not begin once and end once. It breathed. It expanded and contracted in cycles so enormous that human arithmetic struggles to contain them. A single day in the life of Brahma the Creator lasts 4.3 billion years. A single night of Brahma lasts another 4.3 billion years. And when both day and night are counted together, one full day and night of Brahma's existence is 8.6 billion years, which modern astronomy tells us is not so very different from the approximate age of our own sun. The ancient Indian mathematicians arrived at a number close to this through cosmological reasoning alone, without telescopes, without spectroscopy, without any of the instruments of modern astrophysics. They arrived there through pure philosophical inquiry, driven by the conviction that any universe worth living in must be much, much older than any human civilization could imagine. This context is important for the stories we are going to drift through tonight, because the darkness in Hindu mythology is not the darkness of evil against good. It is something more subtle, more patient, more philosophically interesting than that. The darkness in Hindu myth is structural. It is built into the fabric of creation. The gods themselves contain darkness. The forces of destruction are not always the enemy of the forces of creation. Sometimes they are the same force, seen from a different angle, at a different point in the great breathing cycle of the universe. The myths we are moving through tonight are called dark not because they are frightening, but because they belong to that part of the cycle when the universe is contracting, cooling, returning to the ocean. They are stories told in the space between one creation and the next. They carry the particular atmosphere of late hours, of lamps burning low, of fires going to embers, of the world exhaling. They are, in the most literal sense, bedtime stories. Stories for the night before the world begins again. We will move through them slowly. We will not hurry. There is nothing to hurry toward. The ocean and the sound that made everything. The Rig Veda is the oldest text in any living religious tradition in the world. Its oldest hymns were composed somewhere between 1500 and 1200 years before the Common Era, though the tradition they record is certainly older still. It was composed in Sanskrit, a language of extraordinary precision and beauty, and the hymn called the Nasadiya Sukta, sometimes translated as the hymn of creation, sometimes as the hymn of non-being, is among the most philosophically startling texts in the history of human thought. It begins with a question, not a declaration, not a statement of divine power. A question. It asks, was there being then, or non-being? Was there water, unfathomably deep? Was there death? Was there immortality? Was there night? Was there day? Was there anything that could be recognized as anything at all? And then, after sitting with these questions for the length of a verse, it says, with the equanimity of someone who has been thinking about this for a very long time, that the one from whom this creation came, who may or may not have created it, who looks down from the highest heaven, only he knows. Or perhaps even he does not know. This is the beginning of one of the most ancient religious traditions in the world. Not certainty. Not proclamation. A question, followed by a comfortable admission that even the divine may not be sure. The tone is quiet. The tone is wondering. The tone is exactly the tone of a mind that has sat with the largest possible questions long enough to have made peace with not quite answering them. From this vast, questioning darkness, the ancient texts describe a sound arising. Before form, before light, before any distinct thing could be said to exist, a sound. The sound was Om. A single syllable, sometimes written Om, representing in its three parts the three states of consciousness, waking, dreaming, and deep dreamless sleep. And in the silence that follows the utterance of Om, in the fourth state, called Turiya, which is consciousness itself aware of itself, the universe became possible. The physicists of our own era talk about sound in the early universe in a different but not entirely unrelated way. In the first 380,000 years after the Big Bang, the universe was a hot plasma of charged particles, too dense for light to travel through. But sound could travel, acoustic pressure waves, moving through that primordial plasma, leaving patterns in the distribution of matter that are still visible today in the cosmic microwave background radiation, the faint afterglow of the early universe that fills all of space. The universe began with a kind of sound. The Vedic seers said something like this 3,000 years ago, in a different language, from a different starting point, arriving at an image that does not embarrass itself in the company of modern cosmology. But we are not here for cosmology. We are here for the feeling of the darkness before the sound. The feeling of the vast, patient, pre-existing ocean. The state before anything has decided to be anything. That is the feeling we are moving through tonight. Not the dramatic moment of creation, but the long, soft, unhurried darkness that preceded it. In the Bhagavata Purana, one of the great narrative texts of the Hindu tradition, composed perhaps in the 9th or 10th century of the Common Era but drawing on much older material, the story of Vishnu's cosmic sleep is told in detail that rewards slow attention. Vishnu lies on the serpent Shisha, which floats on the ocean called Kshira Sagara, the ocean of milk. This is not a literal ocean of the kind you might imagine, white and opaque and smelling of dairy. It is an ocean of luminescence, of undifferentiated light potential, of the pure creative substrate from which specific things will eventually be formed. The serpent Shisha is called Ananta, endless, and its name is not only a description of its length but a philosophical statement. The foundation of the universe is endlessness. The ground beneath everything is something that does not stop. Vishnu's 4 arms hold, variously, a conch shell, a discus, a mace, and a lotus. Each object is a symbol. The conch shell, when blown, produces the sound Om, the first sound of creation. The discus is time, the wheel of cycles, the spinning that creates the illusion of change within what is ultimately unchanging. The mace is the dissolution of illusion, the instrument that breaks what needs to be broken so that what is underneath can be seen. And the lotus grows from the navel of the sleeping god, on a long stem, and at the tip of the stem sits Brahma, the creator, looking around at the primordial waters and wondering what he is supposed to do. The lotus is an important image in Indian thought, and it is worth pausing here, in the dark, to think about why. The lotus grows in water. Specifically, it grows in murky water, in ponds and rivers where the bottom is muddy, where the light is filtered through layers of silt and sediment. The lotus root is in the mud. The lotus stem passes through dark water. And at the surface, the lotus flower opens, perfectly white, perfectly clean, bearing no trace of the darkness it has traveled through to reach the light. The ancient Indian tradition uses this image to describe the nature of the soul, of consciousness itself. It arises from the obscurity of matter. It passes through the conditions of a world that is often turbid and opaque. And at its fullest expression, it is untouched by any of that. It is the water lily dreaming of the sky. From the lotus at Vishnu's navel, Brahma looks around and sees nothing but ocean. He wonders. He meditates. He discovers, written within himself, the knowledge of how to create a world. And he begins. Brahma and the things he made in the dark. Brahma's creation was not accomplished in 6 days and then rested. It was accomplished in a manner both more complex and, in a certain light, more honest about the difficulty of creating something from nothing, which is to say, it involves several failed attempts, and at least one moment of profound doubt. The texts tell us that Brahma first created from his own mind, from pure intention and concentrated thought. He produced the great sages, the rishis, the seers who would eventually receive the sacred knowledge of the Vedas in states of deep meditation, hearing the eternal truths that had always existed in the fabric of the universe, like music waiting to be listened to. He produced beings of light and beings of darkness, and in this act he demonstrated something that would become one of the defining characteristics of Hindu cosmological thought: creation necessarily contains both. You cannot make a world with only one side of any polarity. Without darkness there is no contrast by which light is recognized. Without night the stars are invisible. The world requires its own shadow in order to be fully itself. Brahma produced time, Kala, which is considered in the ancient texts to be one of the most fundamental creative acts. Without time, nothing can change, and without change, nothing can exist in any meaningful sense. A universe frozen at a single instant would be indistinguishable from non-existence. So Brahma produced time, which means he produced the conditions for change, which means he produced the conditions for loss, for aging, for the cycle of birth and death that defines embodied existence. He produced time, and in doing so, he produced impermanence. And impermanence, the texts are careful to note, is not a flaw in the design. It is the design. He also produced the three qualities that would pervade all of material existence, the three gunas, as they are called in the Samkhya philosophical tradition that underlies much of Hindu thought. Rajas, the quality of activity, passion, movement, desire, the forward thrust of becoming. Tamas, the quality of inertia, heaviness, darkness, rest, the tendency of things to remain as they are. And Sattva, the quality of clarity, harmony, lightness, the tendency toward understanding and truth. Every material thing, every object, every person, every state of mind, every moment in history, is a particular combination of these three qualities. When Rajas dominates, things move and change and sometimes become chaotic. When Tamas dominates, things grow still and heavy and can tend toward obstruction and resistance to change. When Sattva dominates, things become clear and ordered and oriented toward what is true and good. The art of human life, in this framework, is the cultivation of Sattva, not the elimination of the other two, because all three are necessary for a functioning world, but the steady orientation of consciousness toward the clear and the true, even while living in a world that is largely composed of the heavy and the active. The temples of ancient India were built according to principles derived from this cosmology. The temple itself was understood as a model of the universe. The innermost sanctuary, the Garbhagriha, meaning womb house, was kept dark and small and utterly still. It contained only the image of the deity, lit by a single oil lamp. The darkness of the Garbhagriha was not accidental or incidental. It was deliberately designed to evoke the state before creation, the darkness of the primordial ocean, the stillness of the cosmic sleep. When a devotee entered the temple and made their way through increasingly interior spaces toward the innermost sanctuary, they were, symbolically, traveling backward through creation, from the complex and varied world outside, through progressively simpler and quieter spaces, toward the absolute stillness at the center of everything. The great temples of South India, Madurai, Tanjavur, Chidambaram, still work this way. Their outer walls are covered with thousands of carved figures, gods, goddesses, celestial musicians, animals, erotic couples, warriors, merchants, farmers. The entire panorama of human and divine life rendered in stone. But as you move inward through the concentric enclosures, the figures grow fewer and the architecture grows simpler, and at the very center, behind the curtains and the lamp smoke and the priests, there is a darkness that has been maintained for centuries. The darkness of the primordial ocean. The darkness before Brahma opened his eyes and saw the water. Brahma's creation extended to the 5 elements: earth, water, fire, air, and ether or space, and to the senses that correspond to them. The sense of smell corresponds to earth. The sense of taste corresponds to water. The sense of sight corresponds to fire, because sight requires light, and light is a form of fire. The sense of touch corresponds to air, because air is what moves across the skin and makes it aware of the world. And the sense of hearing corresponds to ether, to space, because sound is the property of space, the vibration that moves through it, the way space knows itself. The act of listening, in this framework, is not passive. It is the most fundamental of perceptions. It is how space recognizes what is moving through it. It is how the universe becomes aware of the OM that made it. When you are lying in the dark, listening, you are doing something ancient. Something the universe has been doing, in one form or another, since before it knew it was a universe. The darkness around you is not empty. It is ether. It is the medium through which sound travels. It is the oldest element, the one that contains all the others. Your listening, right now, is an act of cosmological participation. The universe listening to itself, through the temporary instrument of you. Shiva, the Lord of what the world cannot hold. There are 3 primary aspects of the divine in Hindu theology: the Trimurti, as it is sometimes called, the 3 forms. Brahma the creator, Vishnu the preserver, and Shiva the destroyer. This is the usual translation and the usual framing, and it is not wrong, but it is incomplete in a way that matters particularly for the stories we are moving through tonight. Shiva is not primarily a destroyer in the sense of something malicious or opposed to life. Shiva is what comes at the end of cycles. Shiva is the dissolution that makes the next creation possible. Without Shiva, the universe would accumulate, layer on layer, cycle on cycle, without ever being able to return to the simplicity of the source and begin again. Shiva is not the enemy of existence. Shiva is what existence needs in order to remain honest. The iconography of Shiva is among the most complex and most internally consistent in any religious tradition. He sits in meditation on Mount Kailash, the sacred mountain in the Himalayas that in Hindu cosmology is understood as the axis of the universe, the still point around which everything else turns. His body is ash-white, because he is smeared with the ash of cremation grounds, which are his preferred dwelling place. His throat is dark blue, almost black, because when the gods and the demons churned the ocean of milk to obtain the nectar of immortality, a terrible poison arose from the depths before the nectar did, and Shiva drank it to prevent it from destroying the world, and the poison remained in his throat, turning it the color of deep water or a stormy sky. His third eye, on his forehead, is closed most of the time. When it opens, it destroys whatever it sees. Not because Shiva is angry, necessarily, but because the full, unmediated gaze of divine consciousness is more than most things can bear without being transformed into something simpler. In his hair, matted and piled high, the river Ganga flows, the Ganges, the great sacred river of northern India, which according to the myth descended from the heavens with such force that only Shiva's hair could absorb the impact without the earth being shattered. Around his neck are coiled snakes. At his waist is a tiger skin. In his hand is a trident, called the Trishula, whose 3 prongs represent the 3 gunas, or alternatively the 3 aspects of time, past, present, and future. On his drum, the small hourglass-shaped drum called the damaru, he beats out the rhythm of the universe's heartbeat. When the drum is silent, the universe ends. When it beats again, a new world begins. The image of Shiva as Nataraja, Shiva as the Lord of the dance, is one of the most philosophically dense and visually extraordinary objects in the history of human art. He stands within a ring of fire, one leg raised in dance, one arm holding the flame of destruction, one arm holding the drum of creation, one arm in a gesture of reassurance, do not be afraid, and one foot pressing down on a small dwarf-like figure who represents avidya, ignorance, the force that keeps consciousness bound to the illusion of a separate self. The ring of fire around him represents the cycle of the universe, the endless round of creation and destruction. And Shiva dances within it. He dances in the fire rather than escaping it, because the dance is not a performance. The dance is what the universe is. Everything that exists is the dance of Shiva. The movement of molecules, the rotation of planets, the growth of cells, the firing of neurons, the beat of your heart right now, all of it, in the most literal cosmological sense available to the ancient Indian imagination, is Shiva dancing. The great devotional poet Tirumular, who wrote in Tamil sometime in the 7th or 8th century of the Common Era, described Shiva's dance as the dance that has no end and no beginning, the dance that is being danced in the forest of your own body, in the space at the center of your own heart. The sacred dance, he said, is not performed by someone who has gone somewhere special and put on special clothes and learned special movements. The sacred dance is what is always already happening, everywhere, in everything. The pilgrim who travels to Chidambaram to see the Nataraja image in the temple there is not going somewhere to find Shiva's dance. The pilgrim is the dance. The temple is the dance. The road to the temple is the dance. The understanding that there is nowhere to go and nothing to find, because the thing sought is the seeking itself, this is what Shiva's raised foot is pressing down on. Not a dwarf. Not a demon. The idea that you are separate from what you are looking for. There is a story about Shiva and a sage named Markandeya that carries the particular quality of night that we are inhabiting right now. Markandeya was a young man, a boy, really, in some versions of the story, who had been told by fate that he would die when he turned 16. His parents were devastated. He himself was calm. He had devoted his life to the worship of Shiva, and when the day came and the god of death, Yama, arrived to take him, Markandeya wrapped his arms around the sacred Shiva lingam in the temple and held on. Yama threw his noose around both Markandeya and the lingam together. And Shiva emerged from the stone, angry, not at Markandeya, but at death itself for intruding on the space of devotion. He struck Yama with his trident, and in some versions of the story, Yama died from the blow, which created its own theological problem, because if death has died, the dead cannot die, and the cosmos cannot complete its cycles. Eventually Yama was restored to life, with the condition that the power of death could not enter the sacred space of devotion. And Markandeya was granted immortality, not because death was destroyed, but because his surrender to the divine was so complete that even death had nothing to take. The story lives quietly inside a larger truth that runs through all of Hindu cosmological thinking. The things we fear most about the universe, its indifference, its tendency toward destruction, its cycles that include loss and ending, are not mistakes. They are not failures of a system that was supposed to be kinder. They are the system working as intended. And the appropriate response to this, the tradition suggests, is not resistance or despair. It is the kind of surrender that Markandeya embodied, the complete, arms around the stone surrender to what is, without condition, without reservation, without any part of the self held back from the embrace. Shiva sits on the mountain. The snakes are calm around his neck. The river moves through his hair. The third eye is closed. The drum is still. The whole universe is waiting, on the edge of a breath, in the dark before the next heartbeat. And in that waiting, there is a peace so absolute, so thorough, so much bigger than anything the waking mind can manufacture, that even the gods grow quiet in its presence. The churning of the milk ocean. There is a story in the Bhagavata Purana and in the Mahabharata about one of the strangest cooperative ventures in the history of the divine. The gods and the demons, the Devas and the Asuras, decided, for once, to work together. The reason for this unusual alliance was simple: they both needed something that neither of them could produce alone. They needed Amrita, the nectar of immortality, which lay somewhere at the bottom of the primordial ocean, the ocean of milk, and could only be obtained by churning the ocean as one might churn a pot of cream to obtain butter. This image, churning the ocean of milk, is one of the great central metaphors of Hindu mythology, and it rewards very slow attention. The ocean is not merely a body of water. It is the substrate of creation, the medium in which all potential exists in undifferentiated form. Churning it means applying force and energy and intention to that undifferentiated potential, causing it to separate into distinct things: the sweet, the nourishing, the deadly, the precious, and finally the divine. Churning the ocean of milk is what the universe does to itself in order to produce specific things from the general. It is what any creative process does. You begin with undifferentiated possibility, raw material, blank canvas, unshaped language, and you apply force and intention, and gradually the specific things separate out from the general, and some of them are very beautiful and some of them are very dangerous, and eventually, if you persist, you arrive at something priceless. For the churning, a mountain was needed as the churning rod, Mount Mandara, one of the great mountains of ancient Indian cosmography, enormous and heavy and stable, the kind of mountain that does not move when things are pressing on it from all sides. And for a rope to wrap around the mountain, a serpent was needed, Vasuki, the great serpent king, who agreed to serve as the cosmic churning rope, with the gods holding his tail and the demons holding his head, both sides pulling back and forth, turning the mountain in the ocean. The churning took a very long time. The texts are not specific about how long, but the implication is in duration beyond ordinary reckoning, not years but something larger. And as the ocean churned, things emerged from its depths. Not all at once, and not in any order that was requested. The ocean gave up what it gave up in its own time, at its own pace, without consulting anyone's requirements. First came a terrible poison, Halahala, the world-destroying toxin, dark and smoking and so potent that it began immediately to damage the fabric of creation. The gods and the demons stopped churning and looked at it in horror. Neither side could destroy it or contain it. And it was at this moment that Shiva arrived. He picked up the poison. He cupped it in his hands and he drank it, slowly, in the calm way of someone who has decided that this is what needs to be done. His wife, Parvati, watching in terror, reached out and caught his throat before he could swallow, because swallowing the poison would have killed even Shiva. The poison remained in his throat, turning it permanently blue, and the world was saved. The name Nilkantha, blue-throated, is one of Shiva's most important epithets, and it commemorates this specific moment of sacrifice. He took the worst thing that creation produced and held it in his body so that no one else would have to. The churning continued. From the ocean, one by one, precious things emerged. Kamadhenu, the wish-fulfilling cow, whose milk provided whatever was needed. The white horse Akalaisras, swift beyond all other horses. The elephant Airavata, white as clouds, which became the mount of the god Indra. Kalpavriksha, the wish-fulfilling tree, whose leaves contained all the knowledge in the universe. Chandra, the moon, who rose from the ocean glowing and serene and was immediately claimed by Shiva for his hair. Lakshmi, the goddess of fortune and beauty, who emerged standing on a lotus, fully formed, radiant, chosen by Vishnu as his consort on the spot. And finally, after all of this, after the poison and the horse and the elephant and the tree and the goddess, Dhanvantari emerged, the divine physician, carrying in his hands a vessel of Amrita, the nectar of immortality, for which the whole vast undertaking had been begun. The Amrita, as it turned out, was not the end of the story but the beginning of a new conflict. The demons immediately tried to seize it, and Vishnu had to employ various strategies of divine deception to ensure it was distributed only among the gods, but that is a story for another time. What I want to stay with, in the dark, in the slow drift of this moment, is the image of what the ocean produced before the Amrita. The poison that required a sacrifice. The precious objects that emerged unbidden. The goddess that arose from the deep, perfectly herself, unrequested. The nectar that was the stated goal, that came last, after everything else. The ancient Indian narrative tradition understood something that every creative person, every farmer, every gardener, every craftsperson knows in their bones. When you churn the material, when you apply sustained effort to the undifferentiated potential, the order in which things emerge is not under your control. The poison comes first. The precious things come in the middle, sometimes. The thing you were actually looking for comes last, if it comes at all. And the discipline of the process is not to abandon the churning when the poison emerges, and not to stop when the beautiful things appear, but to keep going, through all of it, through the dangerous and the beautiful and the unexpected and the overwhelming, until the process is complete. The ocean of milk, Kshira Sagara, is still there, in the Hindu cosmological imagination. It is still being churned. The churning has been going on since before the beginning of this creation, and it will go on until after its end. And somewhere in the depths of it, resting on the great serpent, Vishnu still sleeps, still dreams, still holds the universe in the form of a lotus growing from his navel. The churning is not a crisis. The churning is just what oceans do, when gods and their necessary opposites take hold of the serpent that holds everything together and begin to pull. Kali, what the night knows about power. There is a goddess in the Hindu tradition who stands at the edge of every gentle image of divinity, who stands, in fact, behind every gentle image, as the ground from which gentleness is possible. Her name is Kali. She is dark-skinned, almost black. Her hair is wild and unbound. Her tongue is extended, red, dripping. Around her neck is a garland of severed heads. At her waist is a skirt of severed arms. She holds in her forearms a sword, a severed head, and the gestures of fearlessness and blessing. She stands or dances on the chest of the prostrate Shiva. She is wild, she is ecstatic, she is beyond the categories that organize most divine behavior. It would be a mistake to understand Kali as the goddess of death, and a more significant mistake to understand her as something threatening. She is, in the long and deep tradition of her worship, a tradition centered particularly in Bengal, in West Bengal and Bangladesh, where her devotion has shaped culture and literature and music for centuries. She is the most intimate of the goddesses. She is what comes when everything gentle has been tried and has not been enough. She is the mother who will do what needs to be done without concern for how it looks. The story of Kali's origin in the Devi Mahatmya, a text of approximately 5 or 6 centuries of the Common Era that is the central scripture of the goddess worship tradition, goes like this. The gods had been at war with 2 demons, Shamba and Nishamba, for longer than anyone could remember, and were losing. Not because the demons were more powerful in any simple sense, but because they had been granted a boon, a gift of divine protection, that made them nearly invulnerable to attack by male beings. All the gods were male. All their weapons were extensions of masculine divine power. And so the weapons were not working. The gods gathered in desperation and called on the great goddess, Mahadevi, the supreme feminine principle of the universe. She came. She came as Durga, the unconquerable, beautiful and terrible, riding her lion, carrying the weapons of all the gods who had given them to her because they could not use them themselves. She fought the demon armies, and she was winning, but the demon army had a soldier named Raktabija, Blue said, who had a particular and terrible boon. Every drop of his blood that fell on the ground produced a new demon, identical to him, equally powerful. Durga's weapons drew blood, and blood fell, and from each drop sprang a new Raktabija, and then she drew more blood and more fell and more arose, until the battlefield was dense with identical demons and Durga's weapons were running wet and the situation was becoming geometrically impossible. And then Kali emerged from Durga's forehead. She leaped onto the battlefield screaming, wild, her tongue out to catch every drop of blood before it could touch the ground. She picked up the demons and threw them in her mouth. She drank the blood directly from Raktabija's wounds. She was unstoppable and she was insatiable, and she was exactly what the moment required, because the moment required someone who would do this thing that needed to be done without hesitation, without calculation, without the kind of measured restraint that had been making the battle unwinnable. She swallowed the problem whole. She ate it. And when it was finished, when Raktabija was dead and his blood was no longer falling and the problem of the geometrically multiplying demons was resolved, she kept going. She kept dancing on the field of battle, drunk on what had happened, lost in the ecstasy of destruction, threatening to destroy not just the demons but the world itself. It was Shiva who stopped her. He lay down in her path. She stepped on him. She stepped on the god of destruction himself, which startled her out of her ecstasy, because she would not have intended to dishonor him, and she was embarrassed. Her tongue came out in a gesture that is iconographically her most characteristic, the gesture you see on every Kali image, not a threat, not aggression, but something much more interesting. The gesture of someone caught doing something they were not supposed to do. Someone brought back, from the edge of the limitless, to the particular. The great Bengali poets who wrote devotional hymns to Kali, Ramprasad Sen in the 18th century, Kamlakanta Bhattacharya in the 19th, and most famously Ramakrishna Paramahansa, the mystic who lived and taught at the Dakshineshwar Kali temple near Kolkata, understood her darkness not as something to be afraid of but as something to be embraced, the way a child might cling to a frightening but utterly devoted mother. Ramakrishna called her simply Ma, Mother. He wept for her the way one weeps for what is most loved and most overwhelming simultaneously. He said she came to him at night, that she revealed herself in the darkness, not the light. That ordinary daylight consciousness, with its categories and its careful distinctions, could not contain her. She required the dark. She required the dissolution of the ordinary organizing structures of the mind before she could be perceived at all. This is a piece of theological insight that has equivalents in many contemplative traditions. The divine reality is not the kind of thing that ordinary consciousness, with its habits and its preferences and its commitments to a particular version of the world, can see clearly. It requires a kind of darkness, not the darkness of ignorance or confusion, but the darkness of the suspension of ordinary categories. The mystic's darkness. The darkness that comes when you have given up trying to make sense of things and have settled, instead, into simply being present to whatever is. Kali is that darkness. She is the goddess of the state after the categories have dissolved. After the ordinary structures of meaning have been eaten, as she eats the demons on the battlefield, and before the new structures have formed. She is what remains when everything that can be destroyed has been destroyed. And what remains, the tradition insists, is consciousness itself. Pure, unstructured, unlimited, and exactly as black and wild and beautiful and terrible as she appears in every image that has ever been made of her. Her garlanded heads are not trophies. They are the heads of the ego, the Sanskrit word ahamkara, the I-maker, the function of consciousness that constantly produces a separate self and protects it and maintains it against the world. Each head is a separate small self that has been liberated from its own insistence on being separate. Each head is free. The garland is not a horror. The garland is a collection of liberations, worn around the neck of the one who liberates. Durga and the thing that could not be defeated by anything else. Before Kali emerged from Durga's brow, there was Durga herself. And the story of her origin and her great battle is told in the Devi Mahatmya, the glorification of the goddess, in a way that carries a particular grandeur and a particular softness simultaneously. It is a story about what the universe does when its own categories have failed it. When all the ordinary instruments are inadequate. When something is happening that cannot be stopped by any of the normal means. The demon's name was Mahishasura. Mahisha means buffalo. He was the buffalo demon, and he had obtained from Brahma the boon of invulnerability to any male being or any weapon wielded by a male. He had obtained this boon through austerities, tapas, the practice of extreme self-discipline and renunciation that, in the Hindu theological framework, generated spiritual power sufficient to compel even the Creator to grant requests. The logic of tapas is peculiar and wonderful. By disciplining the body and mind beyond what seems possible, by renouncing ordinary pleasures and comforts and desires, the practitioner generates a kind of heat, literal heat, which in the Sanskrit understanding of things is identical to spiritual power, that accumulates within them and eventually becomes so intense that it cannot be ignored, even by the divine. The gods had to respond. They had to acknowledge the power that had been generated. They had to grant the boon. Mahishasura, having obtained his boon, proceeded to do what powerful beings in Hindu mythology almost invariably do when they obtain boons that protect them from consequences. He expanded. He defeated the gods. He took the heavens. He displaced Indra, the king of the gods, from his throne. He established the reign of the Asuras in the place where the Devas had been. And the gods, dispossessed and wandering, gathered in a state of great distress and called on Vishnu and Shiva, who meditated on the problem and arrived at a solution that was, from a certain angle, deeply elegant. If no male being can defeat Mahishasura, then what is needed is not a male being. What emerged from the collective energy of all the gods, their divine power condensed and concentrated into a single point of blazing light, was Durga. Not born from a womb, not made from clay or from mud or from the words of a creator. Assembled from fire. From the fire of all the gods together, each contributing their specific divine energy, their weapons, their qualities, their power. Shiva contributed the trident. Vishnu contributed the discus. Varuna contributed a conch and a noose. Indra contributed a thunderbolt. Agni contributed a spear of flame. And each gave their mount as well, their vahana, their vehicle, their animal. And what all of this together produced was a woman, sitting calmly on a lion, surrounded by the weapons of heaven, radiating a light that illuminated the three worlds simultaneously. The battle was not quick. The Devi Mahatmya devotes considerable time and attention to its description, and what is most striking about the description is its quality of almost hypnotic repetition, army after demon army, wave after wave of the Asura forces, advancing and being dissolved by the goddess and her attendants. There is something of the character of a monsoon in these descriptions, relentless, patient, absolutely unstoppable, not because of rage or urgency but simply because the thing is what it is and will go where it goes and nothing in the world has yet been made that can withstand it indefinitely. Mahishasura himself fought in many forms. He was a shapeshifter, He became a lion, a man, a great elephant, and always the buffalo, always trying to find the angle from which he could not be defeated. Each time Durga's weapon found him, he shifted. Until finally, in the form of a great buffalo, his truest form, his most powerful form, his most itself form, she caught him. She stepped on him with her lion's feet. She pinned the buffalo demon to the earth. She pulled him by the horns with one of her many hands. And the demon emerged from the buffalo's body, furious, trying even at this last moment to fight. And she cut off his head with her sword. And the battle was over. Every year across India, the festival of Navaratri, 9 nights, celebrates this battle. 9 nights of worship of the goddess in her various forms. In Bengal, it is called Durga Puja, and it is perhaps the most elaborate and most beloved festival in the Bengali calendar. For 5 days, enormous clay images of Durga, 10-armed, beautiful, standing on the demon buffalo, flanked by her children Lakshmi and Saraswati and Ganesha and Kartikeya, are installed in temporary pavilions throughout every city and village. The images are worshipped, garlanded, fed with offerings of fruit and sweets and flowers. And on the final day, they are taken to the nearest river or tank and immersed in the water. They dissolve. The clay returns to the river. The goddess returns to wherever goddesses come from. And the world continues, charged with the memory of 9 nights of devotion, slightly lighter, slightly cleaner, slightly more oriented toward what is true and good. Until next year, when the clay is gathered again and the image is made again and the battle is remembered again, because the battle, the ancient texts insist, is always being fought, in every generation, in every heart. The darkness in these stories is the darkness of the transitional state, the state between the old order and the new, between the reign of what has become corrupt and the restoration of what is right. This darkness is not permanent. It is seasonal. It is the darkness before the festival. The darkness before the immersion. The darkness before the new clay is gathered from the riverbank and the next image begins. Yama, the first to die, the one who keeps the records. Yama is the god of death in the Hindu tradition. But he is not death in the way that death is sometimes personified in other traditions, as a figure of terror, as the enemy of the living, as something to be feared and if possible defeated. Yama is, instead, a judge, a record keeper, a being of absolute and impartial dharma, the cosmic law of right action, the principle of things being as they ought to be. He sits in his palace called Yamaloka, which is underground but is not dark or gloomy in the way one might imagine. It is, the texts say, a place of great order and great beauty, because Yama is a god of great order and great beauty, and his realm reflects his qualities. His attendants are called the Yamadutas, the messengers of death, who travel through the world of the living to conduct the souls of the recently dead to Yama's court. They are not described as terrifying, exactly, though they are certainly imposing. They have bodies that are dark and enormous, and they carry the records of every life they have been sent to collect, the full accounting of what each person did and did not do, thought and did not think, chose and chose not to choose, in every moment of their embodied existence. The philosophical concept underlying Yama's court is karma, a word that has entered the English language in simplified form but whose full meaning is considerably more complex and interesting than the popular version suggests. Karma is not simply the idea that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. That version of karma is a distortion, and the ancient texts are explicit about this distortion's inadequacy. Karma is the law of cause and effect applied to moral action, the idea that every action, every intention, every choice creates a particular kind of energy in the universe that seeks to return to its source. The return may not be immediate. The return may not even be in the same lifetime. The Hindu doctrine of karma is inseparable from the doctrine of reincarnation, samsara, the cycle of birth and death and rebirth, because the consequences of actions in one life may ripple forward into subsequent lives in ways that cannot be predicted in detail but can be understood in principle. Yama, in his court, weighs this. The ancient texts describe a scale, a balance, on which the soul's deeds are weighed. The Chitragupta, Yama's scribe, reads from the exhaustive records that have been maintained since the moment of birth. Every moment is recorded. Not as judgment, not as surveillance, but as the universe keeping honest account of what has been put into it. The soul hears its own life read back to it, completely, without omission, and then Yama makes the determination. What is the appropriate next experience for this being, given the totality of what it has been? There is a famous and beautiful story in the Mahabharata about Yama and a young man named Nachiketa. The story predates the Mahabharata. It appears in the Katha Upanishad, one of the great philosophical texts of the Vedantic tradition, composed perhaps in the 8th or 7th century before the Common Era. Nachiketa was the son of a pious man who had decided to perform a great sacrifice in which he gave away all his possessions. Nachiketa, watching his father give away old and useless cows, asked, not without some impertinence, to whom he would be given. The father, in anger, said, "I give you to Yama." Nachiketa took this seriously. He went to the realm of Yama. He arrived at the palace of death and found that Yama was not there. The god of death had gone on his rounds, and his palace sat empty for 3 days while the boy waited. When Yama returned and found Nachiketa, he was apologetic. A guest who has waited 3 days without food deserves 3 boons in return for each day of waiting. 3 gifts. Ask what you will. Nachiketa asked, for his first boon, that his father's anger might be resolved, that his father might recognize him and welcome him home. Granted. For his second boon, he asked to be taught the fire sacrifice that leads to heaven. Granted. And for his third boon, and this is where the story becomes extraordinary, he asked to be taught the truth of what happens after death. What is the self, after the body dies? Does it continue? What is it? Yama tried to dissuade him. He offered him wealth, pleasure, kingdoms, beautiful things of every description. Take any of these instead, he said. This knowledge is too subtle, too dangerous, too difficult even for the gods to grasp fully. But Nachiketa refused everything. He said, "What are pleasures and kingdoms to a person who has seen death? Tell me what I came to ask." And so Yama taught him. Over the remainder of the Katha Upanishad, Yama teaches Nachiketa the Atman, the self, the individual consciousness, is not the body, not the mind, not the personality, not the social position. It is something that does not die when the body dies, because it was not born when the body was born. It is the witness, the unchanging awareness that observes all the changes of a life without itself changing. The Atman is Brahman, the individual self as the cosmic self, are ultimately the same thing, seen from different angles. This is the truth of what happens after death, not continuation as this particular person, with this particular personality, but dissolution of the particular back into the universal, followed eventually by a new particular arising, until the particular is fully understood to be the universal and the cycle of embodied existence is complete. Yama, the god of death, teaching a young man the truth of immortality. There is a quiet humor in this, the universe's way of pointing out that the most reliable teacher of what life is for is the being who waits at its end. The one who holds the full record knows better than anyone what the record contains, what it is pointing toward, what the whole accumulation of days and choices and relationships and moments of beauty and difficulty adds up to. When the teaching was complete, Yama returned Nachiketa to the world of the living. And the young man carried the knowledge back with him, that the thing at the center of existence, the thing that persists through all the changes and all the losses, is not the one who suffers the changes and losses. It is the one who watches peacefully from the still place at the center of the turning world. Like a flame in a windless place, as the Bhagavad Gita describes the concentrated mind, steady, unflickering, perfectly still within all the movement. The Night of the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata is the longest poem in any human language. Its full version runs to approximately 100,000 verses, roughly 10 times the length of the Iliad and the Odyssey combined. It contains within it almost the entire moral and philosophical inheritance of ancient India, and its central narrative, the great war between two branches of the same family, the Pandavas and the Kauravas, over the kingdom of Hastinapura, is a story that operates on at least 3 levels simultaneously, as history, as mythology, and as an extended philosophical meditation on the nature of Dharma, the sacred and deeply difficult question of what is right when everything right seems to conflict with everything else that is also right. The war the Mahabharata describes, the battle of Kurukshetra, the great field of righteousness and destruction, is not the kind of war that the Homeric tradition celebrates, the great individual combats, the heroes striding forward in their shining armor, the gods intervening on behalf of their favorites, the whole thing organized around the performances of exceptional individuals. The Mahabharata's war is darker than that, and more modern in its darkness. It is a war in which the categories of right and wrong have been dissolved by circumstance, in which good people are on both sides, in which doing the right thing requires doing things that are clearly terrible, in which the Dharma, the duty, the right action, is obscure even to the wisest people involved. The Bhagavad Gita, the Song of God, the text that is arguably the single most influential philosophical work in the Indian tradition, arises from this darkness. It occurs at the exact moment before the battle begins, in the long breath between the two armies drawing up their lines and the first arrow being fired. The hero Arjuna is sitting in his chariot, driven by his friend and charioteer Krishna, who is also an avatar of Vishnu, the god in human form, and looking across at the enemy army. And he sees his teachers there. His uncles. His cousins. His old friends. People he has known and loved his entire life. and he understands that the battle is going to kill many of them. And he puts down his bow. He sits down in the middle of the chariot floor. He says he cannot fight. He says he would rather be killed than kill his own kinsman. He says nothing that any victory could produce would be worth what the battle will cost. And Krishna speaks to him for 18 chapters. Not to argue that the battle is good, exactly, but to say something more subtle and more difficult and more enduring, that Arjuna's responsibility is to the action, not to its results. That his dharma as a warrior is to fight, not because fighting is good in the abstract, but because this is his particular calling, his particular role in the particular drama that the universe has arranged, and to refuse it out of personal grief is not the compassion it feels like from inside, but a particular kind of confusion, a failure to understand the nature of what he is and what he is being asked to be. Act without attachment to the fruits of action. Do what is yours to do without insisting that the results be what you prefer. Offer every action to the divine and be free of the compulsive identification with the outcome that makes action into bondage. This is not easy counsel. It is not the kind of counsel that resolves the difficulty. Arjuna is not subsequently untroubled. The war is not subsequently clean or simple or free of tragedy. Many people die who should not have died. The victory, when it comes, carries grief along with it in proportions that make the celebrating feel pale. The Mahabharata does not lie about this. It does not resolve its own darkness into something comfortable. It holds the darkness and the Dharma together, in the same story, without false resolution, because the world does not resolve, and the stories that pretend otherwise are not being honest about the world. There is a night in the Mahabharata, the 18th night of the war, after the battle is effectively over, in which a general on the losing side named Ashvatthama performs what the text records as a terrible act. He enters the enemy camp in the dark, when they are asleep after the exhaustion of 18 days of fighting, and kills the sleeping soldiers, not in battle, not face to face, but in the dark, while they sleep. The act is condemned by the text. It is understood as a violation of the laws of war, as something that falls outside the framework of Dharma that has governed even the terrible events of the previous 18 days. And yet it happens. And the text records it without simplifying it into an allegory of pure evil. Ashvatthama does this thing in despair, in grief, in the extremity of a loss that has taken everything from him. The act is wrong. The grief that produced it is real and enormous and human. The Mahabharata's darkness is the darkness of moral complexity pushed to its limit, the darkness that accumulates when good people are caught in circumstances that have no good exits, only different kinds of difficult ones. It is the darkness that every tradition that takes ethics seriously must eventually confront, because the world is not simple and human beings are not simple, and the Dharma that guides behavior in ordinary circumstances runs, at the extremes, into situations where every available option is in some sense a loss. What the Bhagavad Gita offers, within this darkness, is not a solution but an orientation. Offer it all to Krishna. Offer the action, the outcome, the grief, the uncertainty, the terrible complexity. Do not try to resolve what cannot be resolved. Do not try to hold what cannot be held. Act from the deepest and most honest place within yourself and release the result entirely, completely, without condition. This is the yoga of action, karma yoga, and it is perhaps the most radical and most demanding of the paths the Gita describes, because it requires not detachment in the sense of not caring, but detachment in the sense of complete engagement without clinging, which is a very different and much more difficult thing. The temples at night. Let us come down from the heights of cosmology and philosophy, for a moment, to the more particular and sensory world of ancient India as it was actually lived. Because behind all the vast mythological narratives, the churning of the ocean, the battles of the gods, the teachings of Krishna on the battlefield, there was a daily human world that gave those narratives their context and their texture. A world of temples and markets and river ghats and cooking fires and the smell of incense in the early morning. A world that moved through its days and nights according to rhythms that were partly agricultural and partly astronomical and partly sacred, all three blended together in a way that made it difficult to say where one ended and another began. The temples of ancient India were not simply places of worship in the sense of buildings where religious activities took place. They were understood, and continue to be understood in the living temple traditions of South India, as the bodies of the divine, as living organisms that needed to be cared for, fed, dressed, put to bed, woken in the morning. The daily ritual schedule of a major South Indian temple follows the sleep and waking cycle of the deity as though the deity were a living person in the care of the priests. At dawn, before sunrise, the priests enter the inner sanctuary. They wake the deity. They offer water for bathing. They offer toothpaste, an elaborately prepared substance made from specific plants with auspicious associations. They dress the image in fresh cloth. They offer a mirror. They offer breakfast, specific foods appropriate to the specific deity, prepared according to specific rules that have been maintained for generations. All of this happens in near darkness, in the light of oil lamps, with the low sound of chanting mantras that have been memorized and recited in continuous succession for as long as the temple has stood. At midday, the deity rests. The inner sanctuary is closed. The lamps are lowered. The noise of the temple precinct, and there is always noise, always pilgrims and vendors and music and the bells of passing rituals, pauses in some deeper register while the divine is understood to be in the midday rest. And at night, the most intimate rituals are performed. The deity is dressed in night clothes. Evening oil lamps are lit, in many temples, hundreds of them, arranged in patterns around the inner courtyard and on the walls and in the hands of the priests. The evening arati, the waving of light before the divine image, is performed with a large oil lamp on a plate, moved in slow circles before the deity while the assembled worshippers watch and participate by cupping their hands to receive the light as the plate passes near them, and then drawing their cupped hands to their eyes, taking the warmth and the light into themselves. This ritual, the arati, is among the most common and most central of Hindu worship practices, and it is performed multiple times a day in every temple and in most households. Its logic is elegant. The light is offered to the divine. The divine blesses the light through contact with the image. The worshippers receive the blessed light and take it into themselves. The divine flows from its source, through the medium of light, into the community of worshippers, and the worshippers are illuminated, not metaphorically but in the specific, sensory, physical sense that they hold their hands to the flame and feel its warmth. At the end of the night, the deity is put to sleep. The final ritual of the day involves dimming all the lamps except one, adjusting the cloth around the image into the configuration of someone prepared for sleep, offering a final prayer, and then withdrawing and closing the door. The deity rests. The temple is quiet. The one remaining lamp burns steadily through the night, its flame the only movement in the darkness of the inner sanctuary, maintaining the sacred space in the absence of its custodians, marking the presence of the divine even in the hours when no one is watching. Ancient India's sacred landscape was organized around the rhythms of the sun and the moon and the stars in a way that was also, always, the rhythm of breath and sleep. The great festivals followed the lunar calendar, full moons and new moons and the specific lunar dates associated with each deity's mythology. The agricultural calendar mapped onto the ritual calendar mapped onto the mythological calendar, so that the planting of rice was an echo of the churning of the ocean, and the harvest was an echo of the great victory of the goddess, and the festival of lights in autumn, Diwali, was an echo of the return of Rama from exile, the return of the solar hero to his home, the lamp in every window saying, "Come back, come home, the darkness is ending, the light is returning." The river ghats of the ancient cities, the stone steps leading down to the sacred rivers, were among the most important social and spiritual spaces in the ancient world. At Varanasi, on the banks of the Ganges, the ghats have been in continuous use for at least 2,500 years, possibly much longer. Every dawn, pilgrims descend the steps to bathe in the sacred water. The water is cold, especially in winter, and the light is gray and soft, and the sound of temple bells from the many temples that line the river drifts across the water in the same way it has drifted across the same water since before the recorded history of the city begins. The ritual is the same. The river is the same river. The light is the same light. The people are different, generation after generation, but the action continues, morning after morning, unchanged, as though the continuity of the ritual is what maintains the continuity of the world. At night, the ghats of Varanasi are lit by the great Ganga Aarti, the river ceremony, in which rows of priests stand on the steps above the river holding enormous multi-tiered brass lamps, moving them in slow synchronized circles, with the sound of conch shells and bells and the chanting of mantras, while the river receives the light and carries it on the current downstream into the dark. The ceremony has been performed here, in some form, for an enormous span of time. The river receives it and moves on, south and east, toward the sea. The light disappears around the bend. The priests lower their lamps. The ceremony ends. The night continues. Yoga Nidra, the divine sleep within you. We have traveled a long way tonight. We have moved through the primordial ocean before creation began, through the great acts of the gods and the terrible battles and the philosophical teachings offered on the edge of catastrophe. And now, in the deepest part of the night, we come to something quieter than all of that. We come to the practice that holds all of these stories in its arms and makes them, in the end, into something restful. Yoga Nidra, yogic sleep, is not a myth. It is a real practice, with a long history in the Indian contemplative tradition and a growing body of contemporary research supporting its effectiveness for relaxation, for sleep, for the reduction of anxiety, for the integration of difficult experiences. But its depth comes from the mythological image we began with, Vishnu sleeping on the cosmic serpent, holding the universe in the form of a dream. The practitioner of Yoga Nidra is, in the imagery of the tradition, performing the same act as the cosmic God, lying still, surrendering the body to the surface beneath it, and allowing consciousness to exist in the state between waking and sleeping without falling entirely into one or the other. In the classical form of the practice, the guide leads the practitioner through a rotation of awareness, a slow, systematic journey through the body, touching each part with attention and then releasing it, the way the hand passes over the surface of a warm stone and then moves on. Right thumb, right index finger, right middle finger, right ring finger, right little finger, right palm, back of the right hand, right wrist. The attention moves, very slowly, through every part of every limb, and each part, when touched by awareness and then released, relaxes in a way that no amount of deliberate relaxation effort can quite achieve. The body releases when it is attended to and then left alone, not when it is commanded. This is one of the most important things the ancient Indian contemplative tradition understood about the nature of the mind and body. They respond to gentle attention, not to command. The ordinary tendency of the Western therapeutic tradition is to work on the body and mind, to apply effort toward a result. The contemplative understanding is different. It says that the result you are looking for is already present, underneath the effort and the striving and the doing. It says that what you are trying to achieve through deliberate relaxation is a state that already underlies the tension, that the peace is not something to be constructed but something to be uncovered, by the patient removal, layer by layer, of everything that has been placed on top of it. The state of Yoga Nidra, the state between waking and sleeping, is described in the Mandukya Upanishad as the state of the dreaming mind, and in a sense that is correct, but it is not exactly the kind of dreaming you do when images arise spontaneously from sleep. It is a state of alert witness, of conscious presence, that exists in the threshold between the organized world of waking experience and the dissolved world of deep sleep. The practitioner is aware that they are present, aware that the body is lying still, aware of the breath moving, and simultaneously, their ordinary cognitive activity has quieted, the constant narration of the conscious mind has slowed, the engagement with problems and plans and memories and anticipations that characterizes ordinary waking consciousness has loosened its grip. What remains, when the ordinary mental activity quiets, is what the tradition calls the witness, the sakshi. The pure, contentless awareness that is always present behind all experience but is usually impossible to perceive because it is overlaid by the activity of the perceiving mind. The sakshi does not think. The sakshi does not evaluate. The sakshi does not compare or plan or remember or anticipate. The sakshi simply is, simply witnesses, without preference, without disturbance, everything that arises in its field. You are that. Whatever else is also true, whatever the day contained, whatever tomorrow holds, whatever the weight of the accumulated past feels like from the inside, underneath all of that, you are the witness. The still point. The thing that watches without moving. The ocean on which everything else floats. Vishnu resting on Shisha. The universe held in the form of a lotus. The world in the state before it has decided to become the world. That is the image. That is what you are moving toward now, in the dark, in the comfortable weight of the bed beneath you, in the slow and patient breath that your body is breathing with or without your participation. The snakes are calm. The ocean is still. The lotus is floating on its long stem. The dream of the world is softening at its edges, losing definition, becoming less specific and more like the quality of light than like a series of facts. The long drift into the dark. Let the stories drift now. Let them become like the surface of water rather than anything you need to hold. Kali dancing on the battlefield. Her tongue out. Startled back from the limitless by stepping on the one who was already lying down. The one who was already in the surrender. Shiva on his mountain. The ash on his skin. The third eye closed. The river moving through his hair in the way that rivers move, without urgency, without preference, following what is lower, finding what is open. The ocean of milk. Being churned. The poison coming first. Then the beautiful things. Then the nectar. Always in that order. The poison, then the beauty, then what was sought. Nachiketa waiting in the empty palace of death. 3 days without food. Waiting for the God who would teach him that the self does not die. That the self was never born. That the thing at the center of him that is watching, right now, in this body, in this bed, in this dark, was watching before this body existed and will watch after it is gone. The witness. Arjuna in the chariot. His bow laid down. Krishna speaking. The long teaching beginning. The two armies facing each other across the field of Dharma. The sun on the weapons. The dust of the horses. The world waiting on the edge of the moment before the moment. The temple at night. The single lamp in the inner sanctuary. Still burning. No one watching it. It burns anyway. The divine does not require the witness to be present. It is present in the absence of the witness. Perhaps most fully itself, when no one is looking. The priests descending the Ghat steps at dawn. The cold river. The gray light. The bells from the temple drifting across the water. As they have drifted for 2,000 years. As they will drift for longer than that. The river receiving it all. The river releasing it all. Into the dark water. Downstream. Toward the sea. The serpent is breathing. Slowly. The ocean moves with the breathing. Long, slow waves that go nowhere in particular. Because there is no shore. Only the water. Only the sleeping God. Only the lotus, still floating. Still flowering. In the dark. In the dark before anything. The ocean remains. The ancient texts of India do not end. They cycle. They return to their beginning. They breathe. The universe that Brahma made will one day be drawn back. Into the lotus. Into the stem. Into the sleeping God. Into the serpent. Into the ocean. Into the dark before the sound. And then, after a night of Brahma, 4.3 billion years of cosmic sleep, the dream will begin again. Another lotus. Another universe. The same story, told differently. Everything that has existed will exist again. In some form. At some point, in the cycle that has no beginning and no end. OM. The sound before sound. The word before words. The syllable that contains the three states and the silence that follows them. You are in that silence now. The fourth state. The witness. The ocean. The dark. The serpent breathes.